Welcome to Global Ethics Weekly. I'm Alex Woodson from Carnegie Council in New York City. Today I'm speaking with Carnegie Council Senior Fellow Kavitha Rajagopalan. Kavitha is also a newsletter editor at CUNY's Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. Articles have appeared in the New York Times, CNN, The Nation, and many other publications. She's the author of Muslims of Metropolis, the stories of 3 immigrant families in the West. Kavitha and I have done several podcasts over the last 2 years. You can find them all at carnegiecouncil.org. Today, we'll be looking at migration in the context of the Black Lives Matter protests and COVID-19. We'll discuss some connections between immigrant rights and anti-racism conversations and some differences and lots of other things. Kavitha, it's great to speak with you today.
Great to be back. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So as I said, we've talked many times in the last 2 years. We have not spoken since the pandemic started in March. We haven't spoken since the murder of George Floyd in late May. So I'd like to start with some of the anti-racism protests, some of the Black Lives Matter protests, and see how that connects to immigration conversations. So I guess just to get started, how have you seen the conversation around immigration change since this round of Black Lives Matter protests started in late May, early June, or have you seen the conversation change?
I mean, I think the immigration justice and immigrant rights movement has been building solidarity for a long time with Black Lives Matter. And there's been previous statements after 2016, from 2018, and then on through the many onslaughts, both on Black Americans' rights and on immigrant and asylum seekers' rights. There's been a lot of public statements and joint statements. And I think in the past, the Nexus work has largely been oriented around this question of the carceral system and how detention networks can also benefit from a lot of the reforms that are being proposed under police reform and criminal justice reform, and eventually on up through abolitionist movements. And I think now the conversation, what has really happened over the last couple of years in that space has been a lot of advocacy and activism to shift away from this simple conversation of reforming an already broken, ineffective, and fundamentally violent system of carceral punishment and detention, and shift towards abolition, both on the immigrant justice side and in Black Lives Matter. And I think since the protests really started at the end of May and early June, there was, I think for the first couple of weeks, what I saw playing out was this very powerful conversation about who should be really doing, who should be the leaders and who should really be speaking on these topics of solidarity from across the board. So, you know, there were early on, I think there were a lot of questions about how other people from outside of the Black Lives Matter movement, maybe immigrant rights activists, but also people who speak generally about immigration issues, about identity issues, and about other cultures and other communities, really should be standing in solidarity, and who should really be speaking, who should be taking up space. And I think the most important thing that came out of that conversation was this general realization that, you know, really this is a profound, perhaps once in a lifetime moment in Black history, once in an era, once in a generation moment in Black history. So really, although we're all kind of processing our own space, our own place in this movement and in this hierarchy that we have in the United States, this very racialized, almost clear caste system that we have in the United States. And I say this as a person who has benefited from caste supremacy in my own home country in India. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, caste supremacy is just one of the many ways that, you know, we have had across the world, you know, certain people with privilege have really been prioritized and given entrance into the United States. And that also orients itself to the types of relationships that we see in immigrant communities here, and the avenues for or lack of solidarity between immigrants here in the United States and with the more activist movements. about immigrant justice and Black lives. So I think what we are realizing is that now is maybe the moment for, to really stand aside and allow people who have been doing this work for many, many years, who are really organizing and who have really been very effective in shifting the conversation away from sort of ineffective attempts at reform towards actual abolition, defunding, and those are also nuanced conversations. So I think those are playing out. At the same time, I think what has happened is this very challenging shift away from what we see as a very clear kind of, onslaught under this current administration, onslaught against immigrant rights that has been, so rapid and so constant, and so from so many different sides: refugee rights, asylum seeker rights, violent abuses in detention, the family separation, and then, these migrant protection protocols that essentially created these concentration camps on the other side across the southern U.S. border, onward to these the disintegration of and eradication, basically like the stepping back of the basic immigrant rights infrastructure for all levels of immigrants here in the United States. And so that's been a very difficult thing, I think, to figure out how to convey, how to communicate, and how to build public support for. The onslaught has been from so many different directions and at so many different levels that the message has become very murky. And people who write and speak regularly about immigration are often getting things wrong. The details are so nuanced. Some of the statements are executive orders that don't really have any bearing. Some of the policies are being argued progressively at various levels of the justice system in various courts. There are, kind of across the board court orders that are blocking certain of these more aggressive things, and then they're being overturned. And so the process is very murky and the messaging has gotten very confusing. So I think that's really one of the bigger challenges in immigration issues at this point going forward is, I think there's a very clear sort of nexus point between detention activism and carceral justice activism and the defund, prison abolition, and abolish ICE movement. I think there's a very clear nexus point. But on these other issues, it's difficult to really create a kind of a cohesive statement around it. And we're seeing that difficulty play out now.
Yeah, and I think adding to that also is that we say immigrant communities, but there are many different types of immigrant communities geographically, different socioeconomic areas that immigrants come from. So when you think about that, when you think about all these different immigrant communities, South Asian, Latin American, even European, African, how do you see this? This is a big question, but how do you see them reacting differently to something like the Black Lives Matter protests? Are some more interested than others in getting involved? Is it really an individual choice? I mean, when you look at who's come together in these protests and these conversations, what do you really see as far as these different groups of immigrants?
Well, I mean, what's challenging about, like you say, is about the immigration communities is that across the world, political polarization is a global issue. Oppression is a global issue. Hierarchies of oppression are global issues. And as I understand it, I can speak personally to the South Asian community. Indian immigrant communities, we're the second largest foreign-born population in the country. And we are not what we used to be. I mean, I think the post-1965 Indian immigrants who came here were largely upper caste, primarily Brahmin, and were professional, and were really, I mean, many people tell stories of arriving at airports and being given a green card on arrival. The experience of the earlier generation of professional Indian immigrants is not what is reflected in the population today. For example, I think the largest ever mass deportation over the southern U.S. border was about 300 Indian immigrants who were trying to cross over the border. And we know that the migration journey from India now is very, very complicated. It's vast. I mean, we're seeing massive spikes as India becomes politically unstable. And we've spoken about this before, as human rights abuses become much more ingrained and much more rapid and much more widespread in Indian society as political instability increases there. We've seen massive amounts of asylum seekers from India all over the world. And we know that these immigration pathways and these immigration journeys are global. So, someone may try out the Gulf for a little while. They may try out Malaysia or Indonesia for a little bit, and then ultimately make their way across the ocean to Europe or to the United States. There is no single immigrant destination for many of these immigrant communities. And at the same time, undocumentedness, working class immigration is kind of on the rise. So what we see also in immigrant communities, specifically the South Asian community, but also in Latin American communities, is that these hierarchies of oppression are being reproduced here and are being reinforced here by US policy that kind of erases the diversity of our communities and also kind of creates this false narrative that a lot of people in a lot of immigrant communities, in their interest in kind of self-preservation, buy into these false narratives about who is the good immigrant and who is the bad immigrant and who deserves to be here and who is breaking the rules and who is following the rules, and this meritocracy conversation. And we see this play out in every aspect of American life. So for example, even if we talk about school justice or environmental justice or labor justice or labor rights or political voter registration or even coalition building ahead of the upcoming election, you see all across the board, you see these kinds of false narratives being reproduced all over the place. So for example, we know that there's been an ongoing conversation since the beginning of June about how Asian Americans specifically who are experiencing a spike in xenophobic violence and hate crimes and racism, how Asian Americans can really collaborate and really be in solidarity with Black Americans. And this is very challenging because anti-Blackness, racism is extremely ingrained. The other day, I've been doing some kind of more work around school justice and anti-racism in schools myself. And the other day, a Black mom whose son goes to a citywide G&T school here in New York City was telling me the other day that he was surrounded by Chinese American students who were taunting him and calling him racist names. At the same time that we know that Chinese Americans in New York have experienced unprecedented hate crimes and racist attacks. So it's a complicated narrative. I think what's happening now is there's a lot of trauma that's being unleashed, and people's trauma responses are bizarre. And people like to protect themselves and put themselves in a position of safety. So, that can further fracture divisions in our communities. But I think more than that, we need to speak to the fact that there is active US policy that exacerbates and cements, deepens these hierarchies of oppression in our communities. So for example, there's extremely high rates of trafficking in immigrant communities. There's extremely high rates of predatory lending, of exploitative immigration kind of lawyers and services, of unfair housing rules, of exploitative just laws in general, and of course of silencing of domestic violence. So, there's a lot of these challenges in all these communities. And I think what's often overlooked in a lot of the coverage and public conversation about this particular moment is the fact that so many immigrants in the United States are Black immigrants. In New York City alone, I think the latest data shows that I think about 30% of Black New Yorkers are foreign-born, are immigrants. And this doesn't even account for, the children of foreign-born, or the children of immigrants, the children of refugees, and of course the populations that are American citizens who are from colonially occupied or U.S. controlled territories like Puerto Rico. So obviously these conversations are complicated. As of latest count, as I understand it, I think there are more than 4.2 million Black immigrants in the United States, from African countries, from Afro-Latinx populations, from the Caribbean, and also from the Pacific Islands, from Asia, and from all over the world. And we know from years of documentation that Black immigrants in all countries around the world suffer from tremendous amounts of anti-Blackness globally. So, we've heard testimonies, we've seen studies conducted on anti-Black hate crimes in India, for example, and in various parts of Asia, and in Russia, and of course in the EU itself, and well-documented examples of anti-Black racism towards unleashed towards immigrants in the United States and Canada and in the UK. For decades now, we know about this. And we know that Black African immigrants, although they generally, because it is so difficult for African immigrants to receive an immigration visa to come to the United States, many of the immigrants that we have here tend to be more privileged and of professional background, higher education standards, and to have more resources from their home countries, unless you're talking about resettled refugee populations, which are accounts for such a small percentage of the immigrant communities here in the United States. But Black immigrants have all said across the board that they have a harder time finding jobs that match their skills and their education and qualifications. And all of this orients itself to anti-Black racism in the United States. And we know for a fact that, this is across the board. So in all communities, you have people speaking on behalf of immigrant communities in academia, in the media. All of the high status people who represent immigrant communities are all more likely to be people with privileged backgrounds. So the conversation tends to get skewed in that way. For example, if you look at the number of Asian Americans or South Asian Americans who are running for political office, most of these folks are fairly well off, are from highly educated backgrounds, are upper caste, are most likely Brahmin. And so this makes overall policy conversations or lobbying efforts to really address the concerns of the most vulnerable and the most hurt and the most injured members of our community very difficult to achieve. If the voices who are speaking on behalf of, who are doing actual policymaking and legislation on behalf of a certain community or are from a certain community are not aware of these issues, then you have challenges, which I think is part of the reason why it's so powerful to see progressive women legislators like Pramila Jayapal, who is very aware of the needs of the most vulnerable South Asians, undocumented South Asians, LGBTQ South Asians, and of course people like Ilhan Omar, who has a refugee background herself, and Rashida Tlaib, who is Palestinian. But again, this is all more than just identity issues. I think it's very easy in this country. I have been invited, for example, again and again to see myself as a victim of discrimination. And yet I am an Indian American. My parents are Brahmin, highly educated people, very privileged, and I am married to a Black man. And I think, if anything, my experience in observing his life experiences, in being in this lifelong conversation with him, and in seeing the experiences of my children in this country have made it very, very clear to me that our experiences are very different. I did have discrimination and prejudice leveled against me as a child. I grew up in North Carolina, but I didn't feel it. I didn't perceive it because it wasn't about me. You know, if somebody called me Chinese or said, "Oh, you're Indian," you know, it didn't really affect me because I thought to myself, "Oh, who are these people? They don't really know who we are, and they're just ignorant. It didn't affect me. Whereas every aspect of race, of discrimination in this country, it can't be about our understanding of our role as immigrants in the Black Lives Matter movement can't be based on our own feelings of persecution. Because this is not to discount the fact that, there are many people who are deeply persecuted here by ourselves, by people within our own communities, and by the policies in this country. But we can't find the common ground with the Black Lives Matter movement on those grounds. That's why I think it's been so powerful to see the Black Lives Matter movement speak to this pervasive structural, system-wide institutionalized racism and how it functions in all levels of society. And I think, perhaps the immigrant rights movement can speak to that a little bit more and can understand that a little bit more. There's a conversation to be had about, who should be speaking for and with any given community. This is a challenge. Obviously, the people who have platform and privilege should use that platform and privilege to speak and to continue learning. But unfortunately, that does tend to recreate, systems of oppression and erasure. So this is very challenging in a democracy like ours that isn't a direct democracy, it's a representative democracy. How do we actually address through policy, through coalition building, what needs to be done? And I think, if anything, these uprisings show us that this system has broken down. Our policymaking apparatus, our legal justice system, not only does not speak to the actual gaps and violence and injustice in our society because of years of gerrymandering and voter suppression, because of these long-standing dynamics of prioritizing and giving resources to certain members of our society at the expense of the vast majority. I think, all of these things make it very clear now that, our democracy, it needs to be kind of revisited, and it's not necessarily functioning. And so as a result, in the middle of a global pandemic that has disproportionately taken the lives of, undocumented, of poor, of immigrant, of Black Americans, of people who are working on the front lines as essential workers, who tend to live in overcrowded conditions. These are the more vulnerable populations, and as a result, a virus does not care what race you are, but it spreads through communities and networks. So the fact that these are the communities that are now saying the only way that we can be heard is to take to the streets is I think a sort of a powerful statement about where we are and what we need to reconcile with and what needs to come next. Now, I don't know that, everyone on the ground can be asked to tell us what comes next. That's for the rest of us to maybe think through a little bit. Like, they're basically saying we've done, over 5 years of movement building, of shifting the conversation around how we understand carceral justice and carceral systems. And now it's time for you guys to figure out what comes next. And that is where the challenge comes in. There will always be an effort, from the electoral politics point of view, to build coalitions between positions that can be seen as irreconcilable. That is the nature of electoral politics. And that is where we are today, and it becomes very challenging.
Yeah, I just want to keep going with that point. Looking ahead somewhat hopefully, we have a big election coming up in November. We could have a change in administration. And just like when President Trump came into office, he undid a lot of what Barack Obama did. I think a goal for the next president, maybe President Biden, would be to undo some of the Trump administration policies surrounding immigration, specifically surrounding racism, things like that. So when you look ahead to a possible change in administration, what are some tangible policies? What are some tangible pieces of legislation maybe that could be enacted to really undo some of what's been happening over the last 4 years?
Yeah, well, I mean, in immigration conversations, we have to go back further. I mean, immigration has been under attack we've been trying for what, 20 years now to try and get any kind of reasonable, comprehensive immigration reform. Right now, people are not aware of how long it takes to get a green card, how expensive it is, how truly just toxic the process is, and how hard people have to struggle. So there is no real good immigration anymore. There's no good immigrant, no bad immigrant. Everyone is struggling. And I think there are too many visa categories. There's too many different ways of dividing people. I mean, the mere fact that today, you know, if a highly skilled immigrant comes here, and of course there's been a decline in the number of high skilled H-1B visas that are being given out. But if a highly skilled immigrant comes here, this person's spouse, even if that person is also highly skilled, may not work in the United States. So there are so many ways of kind of recreating all of these barriers. And then of course, at the same time, you have this public charge. So, I mean, I think really one of the biggest challenges is this all comes down to what we were talking about before, the fact that immigration reform is trying to speak to we're creating this idea that immigration reform is the same for all immigrants. You know, and that we're trying to speak to different degrees. We're trying to speak to asylum. We're trying to speak to refugee resettlement. We're trying to speak to like grotesque, obvious, unacceptable human rights abuses of asylum seekers, of immigrants in detention, of undocumented immigrants in the United States. And at the same time, we're trying to speak to these kinds of bureaucratic dysfunctions. You know, what does it take to actually get a visa to the United States? Who do you have to pay? How do you do it? How do you come here? How do you then build a life for yourself? If you come as a student, as a non-immigrant, how do you then transition to long-term immigration? Why do we need to have so many short-term, temporary non-immigrant status positions? You know, I heard somebody once say, and this actually goes back to, I think, the Black Lives Matter movement, is there's in immigration circles and immigrant rights, immigration advocacy, immigration scholarship, in general circles that think about immigration, there's this phrase, the border is everywhere. And I think that can be applied to how we understand what's happening with the Black Lives Matter movement, where they're showing us that racism is everywhere. The border between who deserves and is afforded justice, opportunity, safety in this country is everywhere. So for example, we'll talk about gentrification in Brooklyn, where I live, and someone will say, well, this neighborhood is gentrifying, but we also understand that the border between the haves and have-nots can exist within a single building, within a single block. So then that makes these conversations harder to have. So, you know, one of the things that we can talk about with immigration reform is, you know, the fact that, you know, we can maybe break it out. Maybe the next administration doesn't have to push for comprehensive immigration reform. Maybe that's been a failure. Maybe what we also have to learn from previous administrations is that abuses against immigrants, human rights abuses in the name of border security, of protection, have been unrolled out under both Democrat and Republican administrations in the past. So maybe the next administration has to take an honest reckoning and say, you know, if the next president is Biden, then maybe it's very important for him to be able to say to really be able to openly acknowledge what failures and mistakes were made under the Obama administration towards immigration policy. And in the effort or in the interest of having a coalition or agreement or bipartisanship or some sort of a partnership with people whose positions we now can see are just plainly xenophobic, who don't really support immigration at all. So now I think any illusion that there was a reasonable policy position behind immigration security or border security, that, you know, that all has been exploded. This administration has made it very clear this has always been a xenophobic experiment, you know, an effort to kind of reduce the foreign-born population in the United States and to reduce the number of immigrants who are allowed to legally enter the United States. So, you know, now that we know this, maybe we don't have to use the same strategies as in the past around immigration. So to my mind, I think the first and foremost thing we have to do is really address the vast, widespread human rights abuse towards immigrant punishment, immigration law enforcement across the country, in all areas that are along the borders. So, in any city where, you have massive amounts of immigrant populations, we have to walk back the hostility towards sanctuary laws. We have to offer a path to citizenship for everyone. And it has to be clear. They have to be clear across the board, steps. And they can't be weird punitive steps like somebody has to go back to the line and wait for 10 years to apply for citizenship. Like, that does not make sense. That's a ridiculous thing to ask of people who have already endured, decades of marginality. If somebody has been here for 30 years, then they should be able to just apply for citizenship. Why does the path to citizenship have to be so lengthy, so costly, and so traumatic? So that needs to happen. The second major thing that needs to happen is we need to get rid of the bureaucratic dysfunction. So we need to make it very clear that there doesn't need to be so many different visa categories. If someone comes, there has to be a clear process that if you come here as an au pair, as a student, and you want to transition to a longer term process, like, how do you do that without having to pay thousands of dollars, without having to leave the country or even overstay a visa or cross illegally? Nobody wants to be an illegal immigrant. Nobody wants to be unauthorized. Nobody wants to live with that level of fear and stress. Nobody wants to not be able to buy a property or, seek medical care. And we see this play out again and again with the uprisings, with COVID. Many cities across the country have made it very clear that undocumented immigrants will be treated if they arrive. But after many years of being criminalized and attacked, we've seen instances where ICE detention agents have gone into hospitals and arrested people who have sought medical care. So, people are being forced into making these untenable decisions. So that needs to be addressed. But also we have to learn from the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think what I'm seeing is very hopeful, that, all elected officials or all candidates on the Democrat side do seem to be hiring and listening to, more vulnerable people from more vulnerable communities, activist backgrounds, people who now, I think everybody has their role to play. I don't necessarily see that activists should be the only people informing policy, but I do think we have a lot to learn from listening to, this is really a powerful moment, a lesson for all of us who have said what can and cannot be done. In a space of 5 years, Black Lives Matter has completely shifted the way the United States understands the prison system and police and what the role of police should be. Things that were taken as, fact and just accepted as this is the way that it has to be. We have to spend $6 billion on police in New York City. I think this has been a powerful lesson to us that we should be listening to activist movements that have been working on these issues for a long time and have the evidence. So I think in our governance systems, we maybe need to have a kind of a closer conversation about, who should be informing policymaking and legislation, who should then sponsor legislation, and how. It can't obviously all just be based on identity. A person's identity does not speak to their politics. But, there should be sort of conversations about, representing the truth or realities on the ground without tokenism. This is where we are now.
So you mentioned how the progress that Black Lives Matter has made over the last 5 years. I was hoping you can expand on that a little bit. What specifically did they do in your mind that has made the movement so successful? And what can people in the immigrant rights communities take away from that?
Well, the immigrant rights communities they've been working so hard and for so long. I think the main challenge for the immigrant rights communities is really invisibility. People don't understand all of the different laws. They don't understand all of the different visa categories. So it's easy to kind of fall into simplistic narratives. And even very, very knowledgeable writers and I'll include myself in this, we kind of fall back into these narratives to be able to convey storylines that are easy to digest. Um, so I think advocates and activists, for example, the DACA storyline was so easy to sell to a lot of people, but even the main narrative that was ultimately carried through wasn't necessarily true. There are so many aspects of the DACA recipient experience that is different, that's nuanced, depending on where you came from, how you got here. There's a story, this narrative, this is the only country they've ever known. That's not true for many DACA recipients, nor should it be. So I think there's this question about nationality and citizenship and what does it mean to, belong, that should be somehow decoupled from access and rights. Um, People should not be denied like the basic rights and access because of an accident of birth. And I think that should be just kind of accepted across the board. But I think what's really been powerful about the Black Lives Matter movement is, at the same time, that I think I've heard several activists say that, like, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So at the same time that they've really been very clear and focused about police brutality, say her name, defund, all the way to abolish, which, we should be very clear that those are two completely different positions, defund police and abolish police. And those are kind of in conversation with each other, and it looks like people are listening, but, aren't necessarily in full agreement. And I don't think we as a society have to pick a side if we don't know. We can just listen and learn and ultimately hope that, in the end, the move will be less about getting rid of something and more about giving back to. I think one of the positions that I've heard a lot about, and I think this is also true of immigration issues, is we can't talk about defund without talking about reinvest. Somebody once said, there's somebody who's worked, I'm blanking on the name, but a very high, like a high profile person who's spoken a lot about police reform and criminal justice work. And what he said was that ultimately, the only real investment that we've seen over many decades in Black communities across the country has been in police and in punitive systems. So if you take that funding away, then there has to be an equal commitment to investing in these communities. And I think the same needs to be said for immigration reform. If we get rid of investment in border security, in law enforcement, in ICE, what are we doing to actually invest in immigrant communities? We know, for example, even in refugee rights, that most refugees really, they rely on mutual aid societies and on cooperatives and on each other to actually get a start. But in the end, we're also asking many refugees to kind of buoy up and revitalize Rust Belt cities and towns all over the country. So if you're asking immigrants to revitalize your country and to fill gaps, skill gaps, and to fill jobs that can't be filled by native-born populations, how else do you invest in these populations? How else do you invest in the native population so that these skill sets can be acquired by people who are born here, regardless of where their family members were born or their parents? So I think all conversation about removing a punitive system, this is the main lesson. And I think immigrant activists are already doing this, that it's just a less understood movement and less widely supported movement because people, obviously don't understand immigration that much in the country, but they're already doing this, which is that, if you want to get rid of all of this money and investment in these punitive systems, in detention, in border patrol, in ICE, in custom, and there's so many different mechanisms for law enforcement that are against immigrants or punishing immigrants. So if we want to get rid of those mechanisms, then where else are we going to take that money and invest to really dismantle these barriers between safety and and opportunity for immigrants around the country.
Kavitha, thank you so much. This has been terrific.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure as always.
Of course.